Okay, so today we're going deep on social justice. We're diving into some pretty complex philosophy to see how different thinkers grapple with, well, fairness. Like, how should a society distribute its resources, its rights, the opportunities people have? Big questions, right? And it's going to be a super useful deep dive if you're prepping for that big exam coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. We're focusing on a specific section of that larger topic, really unpacking utilitarianism, Rawls, Nozick. Those are the heavy hitters and how their ideas play out in the context of social justice,
Well,
all drawn straight from your lecture materials.
so when we talk social justice, we're not just talking about fairness between like two people in a specific situation. It's about fairness across an entire society, right?
Yeah.
A really foundational idea here is what John Rawls called primary goods.
Yeah, primary goods, such an important concept.
So these primary goods, they're like the building blocks, the essential stuff everyone needs to pursue whatever they want in life. No matter their goals, everyone needs these things to even have a shot. Rawls broke these down into four main categories.
Right, four categories. The first one, political rights and opportunities. Stuff like having the right to vote, the freedom to campaign for a candidate, participate in the political process, basic stuff for a functioning democracy.
Okay, got it. Then we have socioeconomic rights and opportunities.
Hmm.
This is more like access to education, a fair shot at getting a job, not being discriminated against, and that safety net, Social Security, things like that.
Exactly. So the third category, socioeconomic resources. This is about the actual stuff, income, wealth, professional qualifications, having a role that gives you influence in society, the actual resources that give you power and agency, right?
Okay, so political rights, opportunities, then the economic versions of those, and then.
Then you get to the fourth category, physical and mental
Yeah.
abilities, your health, your skills. These can be developed, but they are also primary goods in Rawls' system. And it's wild when you look at how different states distribute these primary goods. Think about political rights, like voting. Some countries, prisoners can still vote. Other countries, they lose that right completely. Huge difference, right?
Yeah, that's a great example. Or think about socioeconomic rights. You've got countries where discrimination in hiring can get you slapped with a hefty fine, a real deterrent.
Yeah.
But others, not so much.
Right. And with economic resources, the differences are massive. Some countries have a wealth tax, some don't. Some offer free university, some make you pay through the nose. That tells you a lot about their philosophy.
And even with physical and mental abilities, you see totally different approaches. Some countries, everyone has to have health insurance, while others leave it more up to the individual. It's like a different view on how to guarantee this primary good. It all really boils down to how each society views these fundamental building blocks and then who actually gets to decide how they're divided up.
And that's where the state comes in, right? We're talking about those institutions, the governments, legal systems, the whole shebang. They make the rules about how those primary goods are spread around, and they have the power to enforce those rules.
Yeah, through laws, police, courts, that whole system. They kind of have the monopoly on force, right? If you don't play by the rules, they can make you. So the big question is, how should the state decide what a fair distribution even looks like?
And
And that's where these different philosophies come in.
exactly. So let's tackle the first one, utilitarianism. The core of utilitarianism, that basic principle, is all about maximizing well-being. It doesn't talk about primary goods or individual rights directly, at least not in its simplest form.
Right. So how does it become a theory of social justice then?
Well, you can combine a couple of ideas. Consequentialism, the idea that the best actions are the ones that lead to the best outcomes, with welfarism, where well-being is what defines the best outcome.
I see. So you look at the consequences of actions and you judge those consequences based on how much well-being they create.
Right. And that leads to a pretty straightforward implication for social justice. The state should distribute those primary goods, whatever they are, in whatever way creates the most total well-being across the entire society. But there's a big but here, often called the rights objection.
The rights objection. Sounds serious? Tell me more.
Well, imagine this classic thought experiment. It's called the organ harvesting case. There's this guy, let's call him Arjun, totally healthy. Now, at the same time, you've got 5 people. Each one needs a different organ transplant to survive. And guess what? Arjun is a perfect match for all of them.
Okay, I see where this is going. A pretty stark dilemma.
Right. If you apply the utilitarian principle strictly, you might end up saying, well, sacrificing Arjun is terrible, but saving 5 lives creates more total well-being. But does anyone really think that's the right thing to do? Doesn't that violate some really basic sense of fairness of Arjun's right to life?
Right. That seems intuitively wrong, even if In theory, it maximizes well-being overall. It's just a really uncomfortable conclusion. So how do utilitarians deal with this? Do they just shrug and say, tough luck, Arjun?
Not exactly. One common response is what's called the instrumental rights justification. The idea here is that respecting fundamental rights is actually essential if you want to create a society with a lot of well-being in the long run.
Okay, so it's not that the rights themselves are inherently valuable, but more like they're useful for achieving something else, that overall well-being.
Exactly. Think about it. If anyone could just grab your organs whenever is convenient, how much would you trust the system? How stable would society be? Not very. So in this view, rights are important because they create a society where everyone feels more secure, and that leads to greater well-being for everyone over time.
So they're like tools, essentially.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
But some people find that unsatisfying. It doesn't quite address that gut feeling that sacrificing Arjun is just wrong, period, regardless of any long-term benefits.
Yeah.
It's a tricky balance, right?
Right. So is there another way utilitarians try to square this circle?
Yeah, another approach is the restricted UP approach, UP being the utilitarian principle. Basically, it puts a limit on how you apply utilitarianism. It says, okay, we're aiming for maximum well-being, but only after we've guaranteed some basic rights for everyone.
So it's like setting up some boundaries, some non-negotiables. You can't violate these rights, even if it might lead to a tiny bit more overall well-being.
Right, exactly. It tries to address that rights problem head on, but there's still another challenge. What about inequality?
Inequality. But doesn't maximizing well-being kind of lead to equality naturally, like spreading resources to those who need them most?
Not necessarily. Remember, utilitarianism just cares about the total amount of well-being. It doesn't inherently care about how that well-being is distributed. So in theory, you could have a situation where a small group has a ton of resources and everyone else has very little. But if the total well-being is high enough, a utilitarian might say, well, that's the best we can do.
That seems like a loophole, doesn't it?
Yeah, it can feel that way. But even utilitarians often argue for some degree of equality based on something called diminishing marginal utility.
Diminishing marginal what now? You lost me there.
Sorry. It's simpler than it sounds. Basically, the idea is that the more you have of something, the less additional well-being you get from having even more. So imagine giving someone who's struggling to afford food an extra 100 euros. That's going to have a massive impact on their well-being.
Of course, it could mean the difference between eating and going hungry.
Exactly. But give that same 100 euros to someone who's already super rich, and it'll barely make a difference to their life. So if you want to maximize total well-being, it often makes sense to redistribute at least some resources from the very wealthy to the very poor. It's like squeezing more well-being out of each euro.
Okay, that makes sense. Spread the wealth around a bit, at least to a point.
Mm.
But isn't there an argument against that too? Something about incentives.
Yes, the classic incentives objection. The argument goes that if you redistribute too much, especially if you have really high taxes, it can discourage people from working hard, from being innovative, from taking risks to build businesses.
Because they figure, why bother if the government's just going to take most of my earnings anyway?
Right. And the worry is that if everyone starts slacking off, the total amount of wealth and resources in society could shrink. And then everyone, including the least well-off, could end up worse off in the long run. So it's this constant balancing act. How much equality can you push for without killing the goose that lays the golden egg? It's a real challenge for utilitarianism.
So maximizing well-being is trickier than it sounds at first. It bumps up against these issues of rights and equality pretty quickly. It's complex.
It is, and that's where Rawls comes in with a totally different approach. His theory is deontological, meaning it starts with duties and rights, not just outcomes. And it's really focused on individual autonomy, that people should be free to make their own choices. So Rawls is all about the basic structure of society, how those primary goods we talked about are divvied up.
And he lays down the law with his principles of justice, right? Those guide how this whole distribution should work.
Exactly. 3 core principles. First, political rights and opportunities. Everybody gets an equal share. Everyone has the same fundamental political power, no exceptions.
Okay, political equality, that's clear. What's next?
Second, socioeconomic rights and opportunities. These are distributed according to substantive equality of opportunity, usually shortened to SEO. It's a mouthful. But the idea is that people who have similar natural talents and put in the same amount of effort should have roughly the same chances of succeeding in life.
So it's not just about saying, okay, everyone can technically apply for this job, but actually making sure they have a real shot at getting it, regardless of their background. Like, if the only way to get into the best schools, the ones that lead to the best jobs, is by being super wealthy, then SEO is out the window.
Exactly. It's about leveling the playing field, making those opportunities truly equal, not just on paper.
Makes sense. Okay, so we have political equality, then substantive equality of opportunity. What's the third principle?
This is the one Rawls is most famous for, the difference principle. It deals with inequalities in socioeconomic resources like wealth and income. Rawls says these inequalities are okay, but only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society.
So it's not about everyone having exactly the same amount of money, but more like any differences have to make the worst off people better off too?
Precisely. It's about making sure that even if there's a gap between the rich and the poor are still doing as well as they possibly can be. And it actually ties back to that incentives argument we talked about with utilitarianism. Rawls gets that. He wouldn't necessarily say every job should pay the same or that there shouldn't be any rich people.
Because some inequality might actually be needed to create more wealth overall, which could then trickle down to the poorest.
Right. So, for example, you might need to pay doctors more to incentivize people to go through all that training. And if there are more good doctors, then everyone, including the poorest, benefits from better health care. That's the kind of inequality Rawls is okay with. But the burden of proof is on those who want the inequality. They have to show it actually helps the worst off.
Okay, so it's not just about maximizing total well-being like in utilitarianism. It's about making sure any inequalities are actually working for the people at the bottom. Interesting. But are those three principles all equally important in Rawls' view?
Good question. No, they actually have what he calls lexical priority, meaning they're ranked. Political equality comes first, then substantive equality of opportunity, and finally, the difference principle. And this ranking is strict. You can't trade off a higher level principle for a lower one.
So you can't say, well, let's restrict some political rights because it'll make everyone richer. The higher principles are non-negotiable, even if it might lead to slightly better outcomes in other areas.
Exactly. That's Rawls' core commitment to individual rights and autonomy shining through. And to really justify these principles, Rawls sets up this super interesting thought experiment, the original position behind a veil of ignorance.
The veil of ignorance.
Ugh.
Sounds mysterious. Break that down for me.
Okay, imagine this. A group of people are getting together to decide on the basic rules for their society, the principles of justice that will govern everything. But here's the catch. They're behind this veil of ignorance. They don't know anything about their own individual characteristics or their future position in society.
So they don't know if they'll be rich or poor, healthy or sick, talented or not, what race or gender they'll be, nothing.
Right, none of that. It's like a giant reset button on their identity. But they do know some general stuff. They know people have different life plans, that resources are limited. They understand basic facts about society and science, the uncontroversial stuff. But their own personal details are totally hidden.
Wow, that's wild. So what's the point of this thought experiment? What does this veil of ignorance achieve?
It forces them to be impartial. Since no one knows where they'll end up, they're going to choose principles that are fair to everyone, especially to the people who end up in the least advantageous positions. Rawls argues that in this situation, rational people would naturally choose his three principles of justice. They would want to ensure a safety net for themselves, just in case they end up being the ones who need it most.
That's a really clever way to think about fairness. It takes out all the personal bias, the what's in it for me stuff. But do we just blindly accept these principles that come out of this thought experiment?
Not quite. Rawls also emphasizes this idea of reflective equilibrium. It's like a back and forth process. We start with these principles from the original position, but then we test them against our strong moral intuitions about specific cases.
So it's like if the principles lead us to a conclusion that feels totally wrong, then we have to go back and re-examine either the principles or our gut feelings.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of making sure our general principles and our specific judgments about what's right and wrong are in harmony with each other. It's all about seeking coherence.
So Rawls gives us this whole system for thinking about fairness. It's pretty comprehensive. But he's not everyone agrees with him, right?
Of course not. Philosophy wouldn't be much fun if everyone agreed all the time. And that brings us to Robert Nozick and libertarianism. Nozick really takes aim at the whole idea of distributive egalitarianism, this idea that justice is about achieving a specific pattern of distribution, a certain level of equality.
Okay, so he's skeptical of forced equality, that the government should step in and make sure everyone has roughly the same amount of stuff. What's his argument against that?
Well, he uses a really down-to-earth example, LeBron James. Imagine you start with a society that has, in everyone's opinion, a perfectly just distribution of wealth. Then LeBron comes along and people voluntarily pay a few bucks each to watch him play basketball. No one's forcing them, they just love watching him play. Over time, LeBron becomes super rich, way richer than everyone else. So the question is, has this initially just distribution now become unjust just because LeBron got rich by doing something people were happy to pay for?
It's a good question. It seems weird to punish LeBron for being good at what he does and for people willingly giving him their money. But isn't that the logical outcome of a system that's obsessed with maintaining a specific pattern of equality?
That's Nozick's point. He's asking, to achieve this kind of patterned equality, do we have to constantly interfere with people's free choices, their liberty to do what they want with their own money? It's a trade-off that he and libertarians in general are deeply uncomfortable with.
Okay, I see the tension there. Freedom versus enforced equality. So what's the core of Nozick's libertarianism then?
It rests on a few fundamental claims. First, justice is all about respecting rights. No rights violations, that's all that matters. Second, the only true fundamental rights are property rights.
Property rights. So not rights to free speech or freedom of religion, things like that.
For libertarians, those other rights are often seen as derived from property rights. Like free speech is ultimately about your right to control your own voice, your own body, which is a kind of property.
Okay, that's a different way of looking at it. So property rights are king, but where do those rights come from in the first place? How do you get to own something legitimately?
Good question. Nozick lays out three principles. First, the principle of just acquisition. This is about how you initially come to own something that wasn't owned before. You can't steal it, obviously, or force someone to give it to you. And there are some debates about whether you have to leave enough and as good for others to take unowned property.
Okay, so no grabbing all the best farmland and leaving everyone else with nothing. Got it. What about after you've acquired something?
Then we have the principle of just transfer. You're free to give away your property, sell it, trade it, whatever you want, as long as it's voluntary, no coercion, no fraud.
So basically, free market stuff, buy, sell, trade, as long as everyone's agreeing to it. Makes sense. But what if something was acquired unjustly in the past? Like what about stolen land or something like that?
That's where the principle of just rectification comes in. It's all about correcting past injustices. If you stole something, you've got to give it back. If you benefited from slavery, maybe you owe reparations. It gets complicated, of course, but the principle is there.
Okay, so you've got these three ways to legitimately own something: acquire it fairly, receive it through fair transfer, or get it back if it was unjustly taken from you or your ancestors.
Exactly. And for Nozick, that's all that matters. If you came by your possessions through those just means, then you're entitled to them, period. It doesn't matter if the final distribution of wealth looks super unequal. If the process was fair, the outcome is fair, even if it's messy. It's a radical departure from Rawls' focus on achieving a certain pattern of distribution.
Right, so this really changes the role of the state. It's not about the state actively trying to shape society into a certain mold, making sure everyone has a certain amount of stuff. What's the role then?
Well, for libertarians, the state is mainly there to protect those property rights. It needs a police force to prevent theft, courts to enforce contracts, that kind of thing. But that's pretty much it. Anything beyond that, welfare programs, public health care, things like that, are seen as stepping over the line.
Because they involve taking money from some people through taxes and giving it to others.
Yeah.
And from a libertarian perspective, that's basically theft, right?
Exactly. Unless you explicitly consented to give that money away, they see it as violating your property rights.
Wow.
The only taxes they're usually okay with are the ones needed to fund this bare bones, minimal state, just enough to keep the peace and enforce those basic rights.
It's a pretty stark contrast to Rawls, who sees taxes as potentially essential for achieving fairness, for benefiting the least well-off. They're coming at it from totally different angles. So let's do a quick recap of this deep dive. We explored these three big approaches to social justice.
Right, let's bring it all together. We started with utilitarianism, the idea of maximizing well-being for the whole society. But we saw how that can run into problems with protecting individual rights and dealing with inequality, even though some utilitarians use arguments like diminishing marginal utility to justify some redistribution of wealth.
Right. Then we moved on to Rawls, who's all about justice as fairness. He's got his famous three principles: equal basic liberties, substantive equality of opportunity, and the difference principle, which says inequalities are only okay if they help the worst off. And he uses that mind-blowing veil of ignorance to try to make the choice of these principles as impartial as possible.
And finally, Nozick, the libertarian champion. For him, it's all about individual liberty and property rights with minimal government interference. Anything beyond a minimal state that protects those rights is seen as unjust.
So 3 very different frameworks for thinking about what a just society looks like.
Hmm.
They lead to some pretty radically different conclusions about what kinds of policies are acceptable.
Exactly. It really makes you think about what the state is for, how we balance freedom with the pursuit of a common good, what fairness even means. These are the fundamental questions.
Huge questions. And if you want a more complete summary of all this, plus practice tests to really help you nail this stuff for your exam, head over to gradeguru.nl. They've got you covered. But in the meantime, here's something to ponder. After hearing all this, what do you think is the absolute most important ingredient for creating a just society? What's the one thing you just can't do without?
What's the core principle that makes a society truly just? Let us know what you think.